around the length of time that this legislation would be enacted for or would last until. Denis Naughton saying it needs a sunset clause. Now, when it was published on Tuesday evening, there was a mention of May the 9th being the date at which it would expire, but that could be renewed simply by a statutory instrument, which would be a fairly simple way of doing it. He said there has to be something more categoric in the legislation around that, meaning that when this is no longer necessary, that it just would fade off the legislative books. Another point raised by him this morning is an interesting one, and he said that concerns house parties. There's a feeling that within a few weeks, if pubs don't reopen, that you could see people beginning to hold major house parties. He said it has to be nailed down this afternoon that the guards will get the powers as a result of this legislation to be able to shut down parties of that nature.
Miall, thank you. Pat, we're looking at an extraordinary piece of legislation, and the expectation is that it'll be passed in the next couple of hours.
Yeah, it's due, the Dáil sitting between 2 o'clock and due to adjourn at 5. All stages of the legislation due to be passed by 5 o'clock. That's highly unusual. Normally this process takes months and months, and TDs and then senators come to scrutinise the legislation line by line. Now, the line-by-line scrutiny will happen when later on this afternoon, when the House sits as a committee. So there are 3 separate stages. The second stage, speeches, so we'll see the outline of the legislation's general principles, then the committee stage, where they go through it line by line. It's not a particularly long piece of legislation, it's about 20 pages or so, but there will be amendments suggested, as we just heard. And then when that stage is finished, then you go to the report and final stage.
And at what stage do we see the amendments? Because we saw reports earlier, something in the order of 84 amendments in total. Now, many of them will be similar in nature.
Many of them will be essentially the same, or are seeking to achieve the same end. Others won't be pushed, but I imagine that there will be some lawmaking, some sausage making goes on this afternoon, some compromises. I imagine the government will have to accept some amendments, won't accept others. I'd be surprised if we see it go to votes, though that is the process. If TDs seek to push amendments, after that there can be amendments brought in by the minister on the final stage, the report and final stage, but that's relatively unusual. But either way, this won't get through unless all TDs who are there present agree to cooperate to get it through.
And we'll see how that unfolds over the coming hours. Christina, when you listen to Miall there, the sort of draconian and far-reaching measures that he's talking about, they are like something you might associate with a regime on the other side of the world, and yet at the same time, they seem eminently reasonable and sensible from where we're sitting today.
Yeah, well, it is an unprecedented Dáil sitting to discuss such matters such as detainment, social welfare issues, emergency payments, areas of infection being declared, and, shutting down of mass gatherings. It is something, as you said, that people might think is something from some sort of sci-fi movie or some sort of film, but these are being discussed today, and people do have legitimate concerns about them. At the end of the day, these are laws that will become legal after today, and they will have impacts on people's lives. So it is right and proper that this law does get
a certain
dived
amount
into
of scrutiny.
Exactly.
But is it your understanding that there is what you might call general acceptance for the thrust of the measures?
Yes, a lot of the parties have supported the main thrust of these issues. But again, as we said, Denis Naughton does have concerns, as do a lot of other TDs as well, just about some specific areas.
We're looking at live pictures now from the Dáil, the Ceann Comhairle there sitting. We saw the Taoiseach there also, and the Minister for Health, Simon Harris, all observing the requisite social distancing measures. And that is a feature of today, Pat. We're looking at, was it something in the order of 20, a quorum just in the Dáil chamber, but some 30-odd TDs outside the chamber?
Yeah, I think there's due to be about 47, 48, 49 TDs in Leinster House in total. But at any one time, I think the parties have agreed just to have 20 or so TDs in the House, so that it remains quorate and also that debate can take place. So I think you'll see TDs swapping in and out, and obviously when it comes to the committee stage and the detailed scrutiny and debate on this legislation, you would expect that the parties have divvied that up in its constituent parts between various TDs. So I imagine that they will organise themselves like that. But it certainly will look, to people watching in from at home, it will look very different. You'll see the TDs dotted around the chamber and the whole timbre.
Reporters as well are restricted sitting on the press gallery. There's usually can be quite a few on such busy days like today, but that's been restricted also.
As are we here in studio. At least a metre apart. So, as we were saying, we expect, Christina, this to pass all stages today, but not to become law as such until the weekend. There's a bit to go between today and the weekend.
Yeah, well, this will still have to go to the Shannon, I believe, tomorrow. So still a bit of workings to happen before this does become law. But the government is anxious that this is needed sooner rather than later, largely for issues that I think Simon Harris was saying that he hopes will never come to pass, that he won't ever have to use some of the powers that are within this legislation, but they are anxious to get that over the line today.
There is a possibility, of course, if the Shannon amended this bill tomorrow, that it would have to come back to the Dáil as well. But as I said earlier, this all depends, the passage of this legislation depends on everybody agreeing not to push those sort of buttons. And after it passes the Shannon, assuming that is what happened, it will of course have to be signed by the President, who will have to be satisfied that it is constitutional. So there's a number of stages to go through. This is how we make laws. It's just we are, in this instance, concertina-ing them into a much more truncated period of time.
And tell me, Pat, because your newspaper has a piece on this today, courtesy of Michael McDougall, former Attorney General. There is a 1947 Act in place. Is it your understanding that these proposals will be incorporated into that existing legislation, or are we looking at standalone legislation, or how does it work?
This is a standalone piece of legislation. It is the Health Preservation and Protection and Other Emergencies and other emergency measures in the public interest Bill 2020, but it will likely amend provisions of the earlier act and incorporate them into this legislation.
Right.
Yeah.
The 1947 Act, it applies to other illnesses such as measles and TB in the past, and COVID-19 was added to that legislation a number of weeks ago, but this is probably just putting extra powers in place for the Minister.
It gives them much more sweeping powers, of course, to deal with this.
Right. And it's those sweeping powers when we're talking about restricting people's movements and, restricting house parties and the likes. It is all pretty surreal. But Christina was saying that it would be in place until March, was that? Or sorry, May, Christina, is that what you said? But is the understanding that it would roll over month after month?
I think that's one of the things that we will see debated when it gets to committee stage, perhaps be aired in the second stage speeches which outline general principles of the Act. My understanding was that the social welfare provisions, the extraordinary social welfare provisions, the special payments and so forth, that is due to elapse in May, though it could be extended by statutory order. And one of the things, as we said earlier, that some TDs are looking for is that there will be a natural lapse in this legislation, a sunset clause, as it is called. Now that would presumably, or you would imagine that the government will seek that if there is to be a sunset clause, that it will be extendable again, perhaps by ministerial order, although I would imagine that opposition TDs who are concerned on these issues would require the powers to be extended by a vote of the Dáil, in much the same way as the Offences Against the State Act has to be renewed every year by a vote of the Dáil.
Right. We will, as I said, go across to the Dáil chamber in just a couple of minutes. But first, our reporter Aisling Kenny, she has spoken to some TDs as they arrived into Leinster House for today's sitting. Let's hear what they had to say.
That this legislation has to be passed. It's essential in terms of the COVID-19 social protection payment to employees, because as you know, we've had many thousands of employees who've been laid off. They need assistance fairly quickly. And in terms of public health, as a former Minister for Health, I'm well aware of the necessity to make sure that the powers are there for our public health officials if they are needed.
We broadly support this legislation as a necessary measures to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, but we've put forward a number of amendments, particularly to make the 305 payment a universal payment for anybody who loses their job, loses income or has to stay at home.
The thing you've got to be looking for in emergency legislation, which is not going to get the type of scrutiny that would normally apply, in that it's more rushed. You've got to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences, and you also have to make sure that people can't abuse it down the line.
And that's interesting. Richard Boyd Barrett, Miall Martin, both Christina there, talking about the requirement to deal with in some haste with this income payment support. And we know that the numbers applying for that are increasing day by day. I think I saw a figure of 50,000 yesterday.
Yeah, huge numbers have applied for that emergency payment. Obviously, thousands of people have lost their jobs or been laid off for a number of weeks now because of the COVID-19 outbreak. This emergency payment will be a relief, I suppose, to some people in the weeks ahead, and a few amendments being placed there to ensure that it's extended onwards. And also with the May 9th, obviously, people will want to know that if this does go on into perhaps the summer, which has been hinted by the Taoiseach, that perhaps those payments will continue under that legislation.
And we learned last night, Pat Leahy, of the mechanism by which the payments would be made, that they would come from revenue, or revenue would play a part in that. I mean, the sum of money set aside to deal with the economic fallout from this is huge, but yet it is not perverse by any manner or means when we talk about the human cost.
Well, the government last week announced that there would be a package of €3 billion initially made available, and the Taoiseach said in his address to the nation the other night that there was, the government had the potential to borrow billions more if that was needed. I think the feeling in government, judging on some conversations that I've had with people, is that there will be a bigger package in total, involving greater funding for the health service, of course, and greater social welfare package, and so forth. All those things are likely to be worked out. But if you see what's happening across the world, you see there's billions of euros.
Forgive me for interrupting you. Simon Harris is on his feet.
Now it's often all we think and talk about. Today's sitting is in and of itself reflective of the extraordinary impact of COVID-19. Despite this perhaps being the biggest single issue this Oireachtas may face with our people, the public health advice is that we cannot all gather here at one time. This Oireachtas, its members, and indeed you, Corla, have risen to that logistical challenge that confronts us. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all members of the Oireachtas for the constructive way we have all worked together. There is no time for petty party politics during a pandemic. I also want to praise the staff here, especially the canteen staff, the ushers, the officials, our own personal staff, who work so hard and look after us on these long days. You continue to provide us with a safe place to work, and quite often are the people who keep us going on these very tough days, and we thank you. Ken Corla, I also want to take this opportunity to thank our frontline staff in the Irish Health Service, our GPs, our hospital doctors, our nurses and midwives, our paramedics, support staff, cleaners, porters, patient support staff, my own Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Tony Houlihan, and his team in the Department of Health, the Hsc leadership team, our social protection staff, all the people working across the public services, and particularly our emergency services, the Gardaí and the Defence Forces. Everybody is coming together in a true national effort. Our health service staff and their families have made and continue to make massive personal sacrifices in the face of this global pandemic. Their bravery and their courage has been matched by the generosity of the Irish people. Over 30,000 people have answered the call of government to offer the HSE their assistance during this time of crisis. Thousands of people are putting their hand up and saying, I want to be on call for Ireland. And today we say thank you to each and every one of them. Thank you also to the men, the women and the children across this country, helping their neighbours, their friends, their families, as we all struggle to adjust to what is a temporary but very significant new reality. We, as political leaders, of course, have a responsibility to lead and to respond to the pandemic. But we also all have an equally important role in responding to the mental health challenges and the well-being that this will pose for many of our people. The individual and national anxiety that now exists right here in our country. Every day I wake to messages, to phone calls, to emails offering help. Every day I see videos of people using their own creativity and innovation to help themselves and help each other. Through these tough times, the Irish people continue to show strength and resilience. They continue to care for each other. In the dark days ahead, the Irish people will be the light that guides us through. Corla, before I move on to the detail of the legislation, I think it's very important we take this opportunity to remind the Irish people what we need them to do. We cannot stop this virus. We cannot wish it away. As our published figures showed last night, it is a virus that does not discriminate based on age, gender or geographic location. But what we can all do is help slow its spread. We can help our health service, help our frontline staff, help older people in the community and vulnerable people by following the guidance and advice of public health experts. It's simple. Wash your hands regularly and properly. Cough into your elbow. Dispose of your tissues. Reduce significantly your social activity. Help us help you. We will only flatten the curve if we work together. But if we do work together, we will save many, many lives. At a time like this, we often rely on our country's greats to motivate and inspire us. One such great, Seamus Heaney, said, "Hope is not optimism, which expects things to turn out well, but is something rooted in the conviction that there is a good worth working for." Let us all here in this Oireachtas, and all of us right across this country, work day and night to achieve that common good. Corla, I move that the Health Preservation and Protection and other emergency measures in the Public Interest Bill do now be read a second time. I want to say at the outset, I see sense in the amendments deputies have proposed with regard to a sunset clause, and I'll work with deputies on this when we get to later stages in this bill. I also know a number of deputies have expressed concerns in relation to protecting and supporting renters at this difficult time, and I know my colleague Minister Murphy intends to bring forward legislation in that regard next week. But our highest priority today must be the protection of both public health and human life, preventing the spread of the virus and working to mitigate its impact on our people. With this in mind, we are introducing a series of supports to help those who are ill, who are quarantined, who are in isolation, or who are unemployed as a result of COVID-19. We're also temporarily changing the rules of illness benefit payments and job seekers payments for workers affected by COVID-19. And we're introducing measures that will serve to prevent, limit, minimise or slow the spread of COVID by ensuring, insofar as is possible, that potential avenues where there is a high risk of contact with the virus are closed off, and that those who are potentially infected are provided with the necessary medical assistance as and when they require it. I will now outline the main provisions of this bill. Section 1 provides for the short title, Construction Commencement and Duration of the Bill. Sections relating to illness benefit come into operation from the 9th of March, the date of the government decision on illness benefit. Sections relating to job seekers payment come into effect from the 13th of March. These amendments will continue in effect until the 9th of May 2020. However, if so required by the interest of public health at that time, the amendments may continue to operate by order. Any regulations introduced under the provisions of the Act will also lapse on that day. These are exceptional measures being introduced in the interest of public health and support in a time of great crisis. They must be time limited, but as the position is ever evolving and changing on a daily, if not hourly basis, there must be an option to renew them for as often as is necessary. This is proposed to be done by government order, and any such order will be laid before the Houses of the Oireachtas. Part 2 of the bill relates to the amendments to the Social Welfare Consolidation Act. Section 3 sets out the necessary definitions. Section 4 allows, importantly, for self-employed PRSI contributions to be taken into account in the qualification criteria for illness benefit. This is only for the specified circumstances related to COVID-19. The purpose is to provide an income support to self-employed people who are unable to work based on a diagnosis of COVID-19 or who are required to self-isolate as a probable source of infection of COVID-19. Illness benefit will not be extended to the self-employed in this bill other than for this specific situation. Section 5 provides for amendments to Section 40, which deals with entitlements to illness benefit. Section 41B changes the contribution conditions so that employees and self-employed people will qualify for illness benefit based on a minimum number of contributions. The number of contributions will be specified in regulation and will be set at 1. This is, in effect, a nominal number. This is necessary in order that claims can be processed and to simplify the legislative changes now proposed. Section 47 defines categories of people who are incapable of work for the purposes of this special illness benefit payment. These will be people who are certified by a medical practitioner as being diagnosed with COVID-19 or as a probable source of infection of COVID-19. People who have been notified, including by order by the Chief Medical Officer of the Hsc, that they are a probable source of infection, and people who are deemed under regulations to be a probable source of infection, and also people in respect of whom a relevant order under the Health Act 1947 is in operation. Section 48 provides that where people receive paid sick leave from their employer, people such as public servants, they will not be allowed to apply for this payment. Section 49 provides that the condition of 6 waiting days, which generally applies for illness benefit claims, will not apply in these special circumstances. Section 40.10 enables the Minister to prescribe the minimum PRSI contribution conditions required for this payment, and as already indicated, this will be set at a nominal level of 1. Section 40.11 enables the Minister to vary the rate of illness benefit by regulation, and the purpose of this is to allow for a special payment rate of €305 for such period as may be prescribed in the relevant circumstances. Section 40.12 specifies that COVID-19 and its variants is the infectious disease in question in these changes. Section 6 sets out the regulation making powers to be given to the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection. These regulations are to give full effect to the measures in relation to illness benefit and set out the details that will enable the principle and policies in the bill to be implemented. The regulations will provide for setting out the people to whom the provisions apply, the manner in which a person is deemed to be a person to whom these provisions apply, the notification requirements, any variation in conditions for entitlement, including, for example, the variation in certification requirements, any additional incidental, consequential or supplemental matters necessary or expedient for the purpose of giving effect to the provisions. Section 7 provides power to the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection to vary the 3-day waiting period for job seekers' benefit. Normally, job seekers must have 3 days of unemployment before they are entitled to job seekers' benefit. As many businesses are closing temporarily because of COVID-19, it's intended to remove the waiting period for people who have suddenly become unemployed as a result of COVID-19. Section 8 provides for a similar regulation making power with respect to the waiting day period for job seekers' allowance. Part 3 of the bill relates to amendments to the Health Act of 1947, targeted at the prevention and the minimisation of the spread of COVID-19. Section 9 is standard provision, providing for the definition of terms used throughout Part 3. Section 10 inserts new sections 31A and 31B into the Health Act, and the intention is to provide for regulations to prevent, limit, minimise or slow the spread of COVID-19. The regulations will deal with unprecedented circumstances, including through prohibiting some events and through imposing travel restrictions. The regulations may also be made specifying requirements to be put in place by organisers of events before an event can proceed. In addition, regulations may place requirements in relation to premises to prevent the risk of infection to people visiting or working in such premises. Requirements may also be imposed in relation to creches.
Minister Simon Harris on his feet there, Pat, and we really get an idea of just how comprehensive this bill is there.
Yeah, so what he's doing there is he is, I suppose, essentially going through the explanatory memorandum of the bill, which is where what the bill does is explained rather than the actual legal text of the bill itself, which is obviously...
Just to be clear, the opposition parties, they will have received a copy of the proposed bill in advance. They're not coming at this fresh, are they?
Yeah, the bill has been published, and anybody who wishes to read it can do so on the Oireachtas website, and that's why what we're seeing now is called the second stage, even though it's first outing in on the floor of the Dáil. The first official stage is publication of the bill. So that's what he's doing there. He's going, Section 1 does this, Section 2 does this, Section 2 does that. And that'll go on for a bit. And he will, summarise with the general principles of the bill, and then you'll have observations from the other parties.
And echoing much of what we heard from the Taoiseach on St Patrick's Night, Christina, Simon Harris, talking about the coming together of the country, the solidarity that is in evidence, referencing the 30,000 odd healthcare workers that have answered Ireland's call, and saying that this is no time for petty party politics in this, as he referred to it, time of great crisis.
Yeah, that's exactly it. No time for petty party politics, and I don't think we probably won't see any of them today. I think the majority of the parties seem to be behind it, but the message, I suppose, coming out from Simon Harris again and again and again is wash the hands, the social distancing, and he used that opportunity, knowing that a lot of people will be tuning in to watch him today, to reiterate that again and again, because he really does not want that spread to go any further.
Yeah, and he said we cannot overcome this virus. What we can do is slow the spread of the virus. I mean, potentially we are in this for the long haul.
That seems to be it. And again, saying those numbers, huge call out for health workers. And again, today he called out for even non-medical workers that can help with the Hsc. So I've heard of a number of cases of people who perhaps have lost their jobs, giving Hsc a call to say that they'd be willing to come in and do whatever work is necessary to tide them over.
And that solidarity, Pat, what we have seen over the last number of days, it is very heartening in a way. People are under no illusions. We are facing a very, very serious crisis, but there is a lot of, I suppose, things to be reassured about.
I think that's one of the advantages that Ireland has with regard to this. Now, obviously, we have some disadvantages as well. I don't think even its most enthusiastic supporters would say that the state of the public health system going into this crisis is what people would want it to be. But on the other hand, we do have, by modern standards, a relatively cohesive society. And I think one of the things that you are seeing is this kind of this strong social solidarity being put to good use. And there's millions of examples from all over the country for that. I suppose the worry would be that if this crisis continues for longer than people hope it does, into the summer, as the Taoiseach
that there will be a certain amount of fatigue.
That there will be fatigue.
What about the atmosphere in Leinster House itself? We saw Micheál Martin, we saw Mary Lou MacDonald, as you would expect, looking very, very grave. Is there that cohesion there within our Parliament, do you think?
There's certainly a unanimity that everyone has to look grave anyway, right. I suppose, Sharon. But I think that, notwithstanding we're at a very kind of awkward moment in political terms between governments, if you like, notwithstanding the fact the government legally exists and will do until it is replaced. But I think there is a general appreciation of, in Leinster House, from politicians of all parties, that they're dealing with a very profound national crisis that will be measured in deaths, and that is something that I don't think anybody is taking with anything less than the utmost seriousness. I think it's very difficult to see where this goes, both in political terms and in medical terms. But you couldn't but appreciate, looking at what's going on elsewhere as well, how grave this situation is.
And all the mental health challenges, as the Minister referenced there, that go along with that. Let's cross back to the Dáil chamber. The Minister for Health, Simon Harris, is still on his feet.
That we would all crave as people in terms of the course this virus might take. But what we can do today, together, is assure the Irish people that they will not be alone as we face it. Gurmagad.
Minister, Deputy Stephen Donnelly, please.
Deputies O'D and Troy. I'd like to start by acknowledging the extraordinary work and dedication from so many people across the country. Our healthcare workers are putting themselves in harm's way. They are stepping up and they are coming back from retirement at an extraordinary level. They're working night and day to make sure that the country is prepared, that when people need to be treated, that we have the very best knowledge available from the other countries that have been dealing with this for a bit longer than we have. I'd like also to mention the Hsc workers. The Hsc and the people who work in the Hsc come in for a lot of criticism in the normal course of events, and certainly what I have witnessed over the last few weeks is incredible dedication and professionalism and hard work from the people working within the Hsc. The same has to be said for other frontline workers like the Gardaí, who have now moved to 12-hour shifts to make sure we have enough police available. and indeed to every individual who's making an effort, to every parent. I say that as the proud owner of 3 young boys myself, now out of school. There's a lot of people having to adjust their lives and balance various different commitments at very close quarters. Individuals and communities are stepping up. They're knocking on friends' doors, on neighbours' doors, saying, can we help you, or are you having to self-isolate? Community groups are stepping up. As I imagine every member of this chamber, I've been getting calls from business people all over Wicklow saying, do you want to use my hotel? Can my nursing home be used? I've had to close my restaurant down, but I'll open it up again if healthcare workers need food. The response from individuals, from families, from the community has been incredible, and I think we should be very proud of our nation and the response that we have seen so far, Ceann Comhairle. The potential impact of this virus on our nation's health cannot be underestimated. The Minister quite rightly gave a figure of 10,000 cases by the 29th of March, a figure from the Department of Health. That would be a very, very large number. Now, we received an important clarification, Ceann Comhairle, yesterday that the 10,000 figure is not actually the predicted number. It's the number of cases that would happen if none of the measures were taken. So if the schools had not been closed, if the colleges had not been closed, if individuals and communities were not practicing social distancing, we would then in theory be at 10,000. But we have seen other countries bring in measures. We have seen other countries, their communities respond to this. And thank goodness we have seen the growth rates of this fall quite dramatically. So Italy, for example, was seeing daily growth rates of 30, 35, 40%. We, over the last week, are looking at a daily growth rate of 30%. But Italy's down to about 13%. The French, the Spanish and others, they have brought these growth rates down. And really that is the challenge for all of us. For all of us in the Oireachtas as legislators, but for our healthcare professionals, for every community, is to bring that growth rate down. And Ceann Comhairle, the difference we can make is enormous. So the figure that we were given for the 10,000 on the 29th of March, that assumes that there's a 30% growth rate every day. Now, if that continues, that 10,000 in just 2 weeks will grow to 600,000. So that's how damaging and dangerous a growth rate of 30% is. And by the way, the last 7 days, we've been growing at 30% a day. If we can bring that 30% per day, Ceann Comhairle, down to just 20% a day, that's 600,000 cases falls to 60,000 cases. 1/10 of the potential impact. So that is how much of a difference we can make. It's how important all of these measures are. It's why it was necessary to close the schools. It's why the social distancing is important. It's why the restrictions on travel are important. And it's why Fianna Fáil would be supporting this bill. I don't think anyone in this House under normal times would contemplate the powers that are in this bill. They are vast. They are extensive. Most of them are not time limited. Most of them do not have a review clause. Most of them are not subject to appeal. These are extraordinary measures, and in normal times we would not remotely consider such things. But if the task before us is to bring the total number of cases in just 4 weeks down from a potential of about 600,000 down to 60,000, then unfortunately we do need to consider measures like this, and Fianna Fáil will be supporting this bill. Minister, you referenced that you are open to some of the amendments. I'm glad to hear that, and I look forward to getting into some of the detail with you. I would have concerns about the fact that there are no real sunset clauses, that the provisions can be extended for any length of time. I would also have concerns around the breadth of the designated people who can essentially say to a citizen, you have to stay in your own home. As I read this, there's a very low bar in terms of qualifications. It's much wider now than medical officers. It includes anybody designated by the Hsc, if I'm reading this right. So I want to get into some of the detail of that with you. We have to do whatever it takes to bring this down. But when we are considering powers as serious and extensive as this, we must, as an Oireachtas, make sure that there are checks and balances in place. So I look forward to that debate later on. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I want to say a few words on sections 3, 4, 5.
Christina,
6,
what do we make of Stephen Donnelly there, particularly there at the end, the checks and balances that he referenced, some reservations, as is understandable, about who might be restricted and for how long, the idea of this sunset clause we spoke about.
This is, there is a lot of national anxiety out there. That's what Simon Harris was saying. And even around these powers, they are very powerful laws that are being brought into place. And one of those laws is that a medical officer can order the detainment of somebody who is suspected to be a source of the disease.
Not confirmed.
Not confirmed. So that obviously throws up a lot of questions and concerns, rightly, from people who are going around their business and saying, well, what does this mean for me? Does that mean I can be just told to go home? So Stephen Donnelly is saying that he has concerns around the breadth of the people who are designated, I suppose, medical officers, saying that it seems to be a low bar in terms of who that person is, and it just seems to be anyone that's designated by the Hsc. So he wants to thrash that out a bit more to ensure that there is checks and balances. And that's exactly, I think, what people will want to see. They'll want to ensure that, yes, these laws perhaps are necessary for the time of crisis that we have, but also there are issues around civil liberties and the power of detaining people at those times of emergency.
He also made a very interesting clarification there to Pat. That 15,000 figure that the Taoiseach used both on Monday night and on Tuesday night. Stephen Donnelly saying there that that was the figure without implementing the sort of mitigation measures that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's estimated that the cases, as we've seen elsewhere, increase by about 1/3 a day. And of course, if you can reduce that increase, even if you brought it down to, 30% a day rather than 33% or even to 25% a day, then because those numbers are compounded over a period of time, that over a period of a month or 2 months, you've a drastically smaller number of people actually infected. So by the end of March, if it was brought down to 30% or so, you'd have, 5,000 or 6,000 fewer cases than you would have. But a month after that, you would have fewer cases by a factor of 50 or 60,000 or something like that. And because...
But the virus is still there. The virus has not been eradicated.
No, and nor will it be until such time as there is a vaccine for it. But I think what the whole logic of this flattening the curve idea that people talk about is to essentially allow the health service to cope. Because where we will really get into trouble is if the hospitals are overwhelmed by the numbers of people who are getting sick. And that's what we see in Italy at the moment, where you have the army brought in to remove bodies from homes because people can't go to the hospitals because the hospitals are overwhelmed. That's what people are trying to avoid here.
Unimaginable scenes. Let's cross over now to our Dáil studio because we're joined by independent TD Denis Nacht. And Denis, you have also expressed your concern about aspects of this bill, the sunset clause, as it's been called, and also the idea of house parties. Tell us more.
Yes, in terms of the legislation itself, I flagged it with government as soon as this legislation was published, that there needed to be an end date for it. I suggested that it should be the 9th of May 2021, but these are very far-reaching powers, and they're not just in relation to Covid-19, the current virus that we're dealing with, but it also would deal with any variation of that virus. And of course, as people will know, you're going to have variations of this particular virus in circulation across this country for decades to come. So we can't have a situation where this type of legislation is on our books and could have people forcibly detained any time over the next 20, 30 years. that a government could exploit at some future date. So I welcome the fact that there is now going to be a finish date for this legislation. The other thing is that we're looking for is clarity in terms of the definition of events that can be restricted or banned. And it's not clear in the legislation that that would also include house parties. Now, that isn't an issue today and hopefully won't be an issue. And the survival rate will be significantly higher than the situation we're seeing in Italy at present.
So that end date that you referenced there, Dennis Naughton, is it your expectation then that this bill would facilitate that to roll over, as it were, to be renewed when and if necessary?
Well, I spoke just very briefly privately to the Taoiseach before the start of the debate today, and he has said that the government is accepting the amendment that I've put forward. So what that would mean is that in 12 months' time, if the government of the day want to continue to have these particular powers, then they must come into the Dáil. They must justify to Dáil and Shannon Éirden why they would continue to have these powers for another period of time. So it puts a finish date on this current legislation. It's a bit like the Offences Against the State Act, which have to be renewed on an annual basis based on the threat that the state faces. And again, we can evaluate in 12 months' time the current threat that will be at that stage in terms of Covid-19 or any mutation of that particular virus.
And is it your expectation then that there will be full Dáil buy-in, as it were, to that idea?
Yes, I think there will be. I think from the discussion that I had with colleagues across the House earlier on today, a lot of people were quite concerned that there wasn't a finish date for this legislation because these are huge powers. Now, I believe that we need those powers at this present point in time to ensure that we can reduce the rate of infection across the country, but there must be a finish date for them, and I'm glad the government has now accepted that.
Just stay with us, Dennis Naughton, because some breaking news here to us in studio. The government has just in the last minute or two announced a 3-month, or it will rather announce a 3-month ban on evictions while this crisis is ongoing. Is this something that you would welcome then?
Yes, and it's something that my colleagues in the regional group flagged up this week as well, was that we need to put protections in place for families across this country. Remember that many of these people are now, after losing their jobs, they're relying on €203 a week. The priority has to be to put food on the table, to meet day-to-day needs. And there needs to be flexibility there in terms of paying rent, in terms of servicing mortgages. And I think this is a very welcome development that's been proposed today. It may again require an extension beyond the 3-month period, but I think it's a very positive and welcome first step.
Dennis Naughton, thank you so much for your time today. We let you get back to the Dáil chamber. Thank you. Pick up on just that breaking news for us. Christina, that 3-month ban on evictions and also that freeze on rent increases.
Well, that breaking news is absolutely massive for a lot of people and for a lot of political parties as well that have been putting down legislation calling for those exact things over the last 2 years, I think. Paschal Donoghue was asked about it yesterday and about some of the UK measures which were going down that line, and he said he would be interested to see the legal advice on that, because it seems to be in the past from the Attorney General that a ban on rent increases was unconstitutional. And I think the same argument was made for evictions. Also, I think Mick Barry had an anti-evictions bill sometime last year. That is huge news, I think, for a lot of people and for renters who have been asking questions over the last week about what was in it for them in terms of supports, because yesterday we had the mortgage break for people, but what sort of impact that was going to have for renters.
Louise O'Reilly from Sinn Féin is on her feet in the Dáil chamber. Let's cross over to her.
Presents us with the challenge of our lifetime to protect health, to defend livelihoods and to save lives. And no one here has all of the answers to all of the challenges that we face, but we have been elected here and we have a job to do, to listen to and to be guided by sound advice, to take decisions and to lead. That is what we must do. Social distancing, keeping ourselves to ourselves, is the thing that will slow this virus down. Social solidarity, community and family are the things that will protect us from isolation, anxiety and fear, and we need to practice both in equal measure. People have responded to the collective effort to stop the spread of COVID-19. They've heard the public health information, and people have made the conscious decision to minimise social contact. People and communities have rallied to the call to slow this virus down. Over the weekend and St. Patrick's Day, people cancelled parties, get-togethers, family occasions to protect and save the lives of loved ones and neighbours. And yet, yesterday, tens of thousands of those same people went back to work, to factories, to construction sites, to places where there is no real prospect of being able to practice social distancing, where there are no hand sanitisers and where there is no adequate protection. And now these workers worry that they are bringing the virus into their homes. This is a concern that must be answered. The legislation before us today affords the Minister extraordinary and far-reaching powers. Extraordinary powers for an extraordinary time, and people want to know that these powers will be used to protect them. So they ask why it is that large gatherings are still allowed. They ask why it is, in this race against time, the government has not yet introduced measures to give full effect to social distancing. Nobody relishes the idea of what is called lockdown, but people do want the full assurance that half measures aren't being taken, that corners aren't being cut, and that every necessary measure is being deployed to protect their health and safety, and that these things are being done now. And I believe the government must give this reassurance to people, give full explanations of what's happening and when and why. Because orderly, decisive action is the thing that brings about calm and reassurance. Equally, Minister, people must know that the powers vested in you are used only and exclusively for the purposes of addressing this crisis. Tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs. Many more will lose their jobs in the days and weeks ahead, and as businesses have had to close their doors. And for these families, the fear of the virus is now matched by the fear of bills that cannot be paid, rents that cannot be paid, mortgages that might go into default. Today's legislation is just the start of the welfare response for these families. Illness benefit and job seekers payments are just part of what must be a comprehensive response. And it should be said that anybody will struggle on €305 a week. I think that has to be acknowledged. The memory of the banking crisis and financial crisis is still fresh in people's minds. The disastrous cutbacks and austerity had dire social consequences. We cannot walk that path again. The people of this state bailed out the country's banks a decade ago, and the legacy of that crisis still prevails. It was the resilience of ordinary workers that got our economy back on its feet. So now, in the eye of this new storm, the state must deliver for its people as guardian of the common good. That is our job here. At this time, people's homes are their sanctuaries. Never before has the need for a secure roof over your head been greater. And that's why today we have put forward an amendment to the legislation that will prohibit evictions for the period that this legislation is in place. I believe that must be upheld in the common good, and that no threat of eviction should hang over anybody's head at this time of crisis. We have to ensure that no person is left behind. It's our responsibility here to show leadership and to reassure people that we can get through this crisis, and I have no doubt, Ceann Comhairle, that we can do that. Indeed, we need look no further for our inspiration than to the example of our healthcare workers who have signed up now, many of them returning in their tens of thousands, to work in our hospitals and our communities and to deal with the crisis. They are the ones whose example we should follow. So in that spirit, today, the Dáil needs to resolve that during this emergency that no renter will be left unable to pay their rent. that nobody will be forced into default of their mortgage, that nobody will have their utilities or their phone cut off, that nobody will be left without enough income to put food on the table, and that no viable business will be left unsupported. No frontline worker either will be left without the basic protections necessary to do their job. Everything that we do now, socially, economically and politically, must have as its sole priority the health and well-being of workers and families, because this is a time for us all to pull together. The Dáil will meet again next week to take further decisions. I believe that the work of the Dáil cannot cease at a time of national emergency. I believe that together we have to approach this crisis with resolve and with determination. And I want to again acknowledge the work of everybody who has been involved in this public health response. I want to commend all of you, each one of you, for your work thus far. Your work is invaluable. We salute you and your efforts at this time. Special tribute must be paid to our staff, our health staff across the Irish health system, but in our hospitals in particular. Truly, these are the people at the front line of this crisis, and none are more deserving of our respect, our admiration and our support. And so we need to do our bit. We need a single island-wide response. We live on a small island and we must be in lockstep, north and south. That's the only way that we can keep our people safe, because this is a road that we walk together. In years to come, Count Corla, we'll talk about life before the coronavirus and life after the virus. But for now, the most important time is the present, the here and now at this daunting time. There is no doubt that we shall overcome. The togetherness we see in our communities, the bravery and professionalism of our frontline health workers, and the enduring spirit of our people should fill us all with hope. Because we've overcome hardship in generations in the past, we are no strangers to dark days, but we will endure together.
Count Corla, and just I suppose before we get into debating the substantive legislation, this morning I was in my constituency office in Swords, and it's closed at the moment, closed to the public, but we're helping people as much as we can over the phone. And I just, so some of the stories that we have heard are absolutely heartbreaking. I was a trade union official, most of you know this, for a long time, and I worked with people who lost their jobs, but they generally saw it coming. Even if the boss wouldn't tell you that you were losing your job, you'd know. You'd see there weren't as many customers, you know, they're not as busy as you had been, so you kind of have an inkling. But this has hit people like a freight train, and I won't lie to you, I sobbed my heart out coming in here this morning. And I spent an hour in my constituency office. I don't know how Marion is doing it, or any of our Marions, because they are literally, they are dealing with people whose lives are falling apart. And, you know, you balance that against the nurses and the doctors and the healthcare workers and the cleaners, and they're putting themselves into a situation where they know it is dangerous, where they know they could get sick, and they're doing it willingly. They're ringing up to come out of retirement. This, in many ways, brings out the best in us. But, you know, it's not enough to say, we hope your landlord won't evict you, because these people have just had every piece of certainty in their life whipped out from under them. So it's not enough to say, we hope that there'll be forbearance from the financial institutions. I think we need to give them a little bit more certainty, and I know that that's what people want to do, and I think that that's our work here, because I mean, we're not in the hospitals, we're not in the front line, as it were, of this, but we have to do everything that we can do here as legislators. We have to listen to what people are saying, and when you lose your job, it's absolutely terrifying. When two people in the house lose their job, it's even worse. But if you had the assurance that you couldn't be evicted, that at the very least, when everything else was falling down around your ears, that you could at least think this house, this place where we live, we can keep it. And I think that's really important work. We need to absolutely do that. And I welcome that there will be legislation tabled. And I think we may have an opportunity here. Ceann Comhairle, I obviously want to pay tribute to the men and women in our health service, every grade, group and category, every single one of them, be it whatever amount of time that they're given. I think that's, that's extremely important. And I think for us, there's other people who are there, like the supermarket shelves are stocked, people can get food, our pharmacies can have access to supplies. That's not for nothing, that didn't happen by accident. And, to all of those people as well, I know that they're watching and they're out there doing that work and they want to know. And also a special word to the people who are battling misinformation, because that's a tsunami that's coming at us that, I think when all of this is over, we might meet and consider legislation to deal with. I won't name the particular social media app, but we all know the one I'm talking about, where the various theories are expounded on, and where virologists who we don't know or ever see apparently go to do some of their best work. Where they're not seeing the front line. I think
and Louise O'Reilly, they're painting a powerful picture of the crushing personal cost of this virus on people's lives. And before Louise O'Reilly, Sinn Féin President Mary Lou MacDonald, Pat Lee, he's suggesting that these powers should go further and that this is really just the beginning of the social welfare response that we should see.
Well, certainly, I think if the crisis persists, and in a way, as you were saying earlier, if the measures, the social distancing measures and so forth, urged on us by the government are successful, then that will prolong the period of mass infection, and that is what we're aiming for. But if that does happen, and it's not so much an economic slowdown as almost coming to an economic standstill that we've seen in recent days, then much greater fiscal firepower is going to be required of the government to be deployed in various ways, amongst them in social welfare payments and so forth. And I think internationally, that's what you're seeing with governments trying to get ahead of that. Only the other day, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer announcing a 330 billion package.
And we heard Congress yesterday talking about a wall of money in the order of $1 trillion. I don't even know what $1 trillion is. But just to go back
it's a hell of a lot of money. We're seeing in the US an $850 billion stimulus with the possibility of $1,000 checks being sent to every American. The ECB last night making a late night but very important intervention, where it said essentially that they will that they will provide the sort of capacity, fiscal capacity for governments, for banks, for businesses, whatever it takes, being the famous phrase that was used back at the height of the financial crisis by Mario Draghi. Essentially, everybody is now saying whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. So something there referenced by Mary Lou MacDonald that will be of interest to the man and the woman on the street. We've had news today on the renter, on the tenant front, Christina, but she was urging utilities now to step up to the mark.
Yeah, I think that will be the next big discussion in the next couple of days. She was saying no person should be left behind, and as we see, government has had to make serious decisions very fast. So we've seen things on the mortgages, the rents. I think the next focus will be on the likes of ESB, the electricity suppliers and all the rest, in terms of those bills, and that will be coming through the doors for people who will also have concerns. But as well, the knock-on effect of some of these decisions, as much as these are going to help people in the short term, rent freezes and mortgage breaks, when we come out of this, which Mary Lou MacDonald says that we will, and she has every hope that we will if everyone pulls together on it, there's going to be bigger issues coming down the line in terms of in terms of even, say, mortgages. You know, what happens to those loans if they can't repay that money at the end as a put on the end? There's still bigger questions that we're going to be talking about probably for months ahead from all this.
And we saw some of that yesterday, didn't we, with Paschal Donohoe, Minister Paschal Donohoe's meeting with the 5 banks. We have a range of flexibility and forbearance measures in place, but they are not a solution in and of themselves. They're a bit of a holding solution.
Yeah, I think the sort of timescale that everybody's thinking of is that you get beyond Easter and then it may be possible to begin some sort of a managed return to normality. But there's no guarantee at all that that would be the case. And this is the one thing that everybody in government that I speak to about this crisis has been saying to me in recent days is we just have to wait and see for the next few weeks.
Let's cross over because Eamon Ryan is on his feet. Thanks, Pat.
Touching me, touching you. Sweet Jesus, you could not make it up for being out of tune with where we all were. And in some ways, I felt at that moment, do you know the same way back in the 80s, whatever we decided collectively on our soccer supporters going abroad, well, if other people are going to be hooligans, we're going to be the #1 best behaved people in the planet collectively. That same sense there at that moment, we're not going to do that, hands touching hands, we're going to look after each other. And I know there's questions, people saying, well, would we get fatigue in terms of our behavioural response? Anyone who thinks that, any scientist, has yet to meet my mother. Mary Ryan, who's at home, I'm sure, watching this, like many a mother and father and grandfather out there. If there was an antiviral Olympics, we'd win gold. She'd make the Chinese Communist government look like wimps when it comes to the measures that will be taken to hold this threat at bay. We're going to be good at this. We're going to take it on. We're going to pull together, as Taoiseach, you and others have said. It's interesting, we were chatting at one of our meetings, discussing, I hope we're not breaking confidence here, just this issue. We're agreed that we're going to go the suppression route, not the mitigation. We may have to, if things go wrong, we may have to go down the line in mitigation. But for the moment, we're going to take on the suppression route. Now, how we do that, where we maintain the mental health of our people, is important. And I was citing an example the other day. Could we keep our hardware shops open? I know that's not the most important thing or whatever, but if we kept our hardware shops open, and if we have to work from home or be at home for a period, well, let's paint the back of the house with the paint from that hardware shop. Or let's get every south-facing windowsill in this country and let's plant our seeds in the next week, so that if there is any supply crisis in fruit in 2 or 3 months' time when this really hits hard, we'll have our salads ready to go. Everyone's home, every windowsill, all of us being part of the solution. I think we need, Taoiseach, when I said this to you yesterday, as leaders, we agreed it, we need to come together and get more political involvement in the solutions. I regret Minister McHugh isn't here at the moment, because I'll be honest, I was keen, that's another example of what we could do. I know the announcement today, and I'm not second-guessing the government in anything here or criticising, but Jesus, I would love, have we done those orals, Leaving Cert orals by Skype? Could we not have done that? You know, if everyone else is mobilising, I think we could have mobilised our teaching profession and every single Leaving Cert student to maybe get the orals done in some online way. It's just one example of and I think that health issue, that mental health issue, particularly actually I'd say for those Leaving Cert students, we all know how stressful it is. I'd love to give them the reassurance that actually we will be able to do this maybe in June or July, no later. Like if we can set out here in an organised way, Leaving Cert is a very regulated event. Spreading people out and making sure everyone doesn't move one way or the other, that shouldn't be beyond our capabilities to organise. I just mentioned that as an example. I have to echo here the thank you to our public servants. We've been talking to medics, all of us anaesthetists right in the front line, knowing that the calm before the storm, but the storm's about to hit. And fair play to them, one and all, for standing up for public service, for their people. We support them in every way we can. I think we also have to look at our unity and solidarity as a political system. I'm glad in a way we were in a bit of lockdown in the last week or two, not really talking politics too much, and I think that maybe wasn't a bad thing, because we could focus on the public service message, which was actually key. I think we've got that herd sense here around we're going to take this on, and we've been clear and consistent in our messaging, but we recognise that we also in our political system have to show the same solidarity in how we work together, and we as a party will commit to do whatever we can in that way, working with other parties as needs be in the coming weeks and months. But we do need to up our game. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult. Decisions have to be made. but I think the Irish people are up for it. I think we're going to be good at it, as hard and as difficult as the times are. Thank you.
Ceann Comhairle, only a few short weeks ago I signed the role of the 33rd Dáil as a newly elected TD. The clerk of the Dáil at the time was gracious enough to guide me through some of the historical registers that date back to the earliest days of the state. Looking then at the role of the second Dáil, which had only sit for a few months as the War of Independence gave way to the Civil War, I thought then how different that troubled time was from the context of our own election. How much has happened in the intervening weeks, and our world and country stand much changed, with much change to come. Indeed, the first Dáil convened when the spectre of another global pandemic, the Spanish flu, still stalked the continent. On its first sitting in January 1919, only 27 members sat in the Mansion House. Many who did not attend were recorded as Yebert, banished, or Fui Glas, imprisoned. There's a strange echo of that history as I look around this Dáil.
Pat, we heard there from Eamon Ryan, the leader of the Green Party, injecting a bit of humour and a bit of colour into proceedings, and in the times that are in it, I don't think anybody would have a problem with that.
Indeed, salvation by salad, I think, is one of the things that Eamon Ryan was suggesting. Certainly a singular contribution from Eamon Ryan, not without useful suggestions in a general sense, I suppose, although I'm not sure they add a great deal to the debate on this legislation, which is, I suppose, what we're supposed to be seeing. Now, it should be said that this is the second stage. It's a speech. Speeches tend to concentrate on the general principles, but the general principles of the legislation rather than of the broader political situation, which is what we've got from several
and
speakers.
Particularly in circumstances where this is being truncated into a couple of hours. We're an hour and almost 10 minutes into proceedings.
Yeah, now we didn't hear the speaking arrangements at the start, which will have been laid out by the Ceann Comhairle at the start. So it may look like we are, going to run over time on this, but that may not exactly be the situation. I would expect second stage probably will conclude fairly shortly, and then you go on to the committee stage, which is the line-by-line scrutiny of the legislation, and that will involve discussion and agreement, or not, on the amendments that have been put forward on things like the sunset clause and so forth. And there's already been indication from government, as we heard earlier, that some of those amendments to the legislation will be accepted. So that's the real law-making bit of it. This bit of it is just for show, really.
OK, just for show. Christina?
Yeah, some interesting contributions there from Eamon Ryan, speaking about the fatigue that people are talking about, that maybe in a couple of weeks' time everybody will get a bit fed up and sort of throw out any sort of the social distancing rules and all the rest. And he's saying that really that can't happen in terms of the vulnerable people, and speaking about his own mother who's at home watching, and all the other elderly people who perhaps, they're the ones that everybody is concerned about here. I thought
that's absolutely key, because he did say if there were an antiviral Olympics, we'd be there on the podium with the gold medal. But
he's saying that
you're absolutely correct about that fatigue.
Yeah,
thing.
but he's saying that Irish people now are really rallying together, and I think Louise O'Reilly there from Sinn Féin as well, giving sort of an emotional contribution, saying that she was sobbing her heart out on the way into the Dáil, having spoken to a lot of her constituents who overnight have pretty much been told that they have no job. And as she said, a lot of people, couldn't see sometimes that their job loss is coming, and this was pretty much like a freight train to them, but that people are doing practical things in terms of trying to help each other out, be it, Eamon Ryan saying get out and paint that back wall in your garden.
Keep the hardware shops open.
Planting the seeds, but also, people are rallying together in terms of how to educate their children at home, how to get people out and about. So it has seen that community coming together, which I think a lot of people will be quite overwhelmed by.
Yes, and there is that sense of we're all in this together, Pat, isn't there? But those difficulties, those mental health challenges, nobody underestimating those. And in fact, I suppose when Mary Lou MacDonald, in fact it was, that evoked the austerity years, saying that we cannot go back there. This cannot be a revisit of that chapter.
Yeah, I think that widely commented upon sense of social solidarity and national purpose is real, and it's also a significant advantage for this society in tackling this challenge. But it won't do it on its own. You know, new laws, extra fiscal firepower, money that the state will have to borrow and therefore pay interest on will need to be sourced on the markets and channeled, amongst other places, into social welfare to keep people on their feet. But a nation living on borrowed money to pay social welfare is not something that is sustainable over a very long period of time. And I think that the real difficulty here is going to come that if this crisis goes on for longer than a few months, that's when you will run into all sorts of very severe problems.
Deputy Oisin Smith of the Green Party is on his feet. Thank you, Pat.
To help with contact tracing. I know that our health officials have quickly moved to learn from these countries. People should know the Herculean efforts of our health service workers. They know that their own lives are at risk on the front line, and still they protect us every day. These emergency powers will not beat the virus alone. Every Irish person needs to rely on one another to do our share. We need to slow the spread by keeping a distance from each other. Well, if we ask people to work together, politicians must work together too. As politicians, we still have to question the government. We must represent our citizens and we must suggest how to improve our law, but always with the aim of making things better. In a few months' time, when this has calmed down, we can get back to the normal business of politics and form a government to govern when our people are safe again. When all this is over, we will emerge stronger, knowing that